So in this lecture, we're going to talk about depression. And depression is one of those ubiquitous issues that is everywhere. And I just was very redundant because ubiquitous means everywhere, okay? But my point to you is you will see this issue frequently in whatever context that you're in. And each context sort of has a different flavor to its depression. So a North American sort of middle class version of depression is going to have similar elements to an African or some other culture's version of depression, but there's going to be distinct elements about the causes and the content of that depression. We're going to explore that with you today. I want to give you a framework to approach what is a universal problem. So as I get into the introduction and we talk about the experience of depression, I want to make it clear again to you that this is just one narrative of what can lead to depression. And that just like there are 1,000 different reasons people look at pornography, there are 1,000 different reasons people can waste away in anxiety, there are 1,000 different reasons why people can be depressed. So I'm going to give you the framework that will help you, hopefully, assess that according to our model of human experience. Okay? So let's talk about the experience of depression. As I do this, again, I want you to be thinking about our model here of human experience. And without looking down at your notes, you should mentally be able to do this at this point, where we talk about the functions of the heart being cognitive, affective, and volitional. And those responses are in the context of God, self, others, and circumstance. I need that black pen. I forgot that. So as I describe this to you in narrative form, mark down in your notes or make mental notes of how you would categorize the different aspects of this person's experience as a way to help her with her unique version of depression. A young mom in your small group at church comes to you because she's depressed. She doesn't understand why she constantly feels the way she does. Deflated, hopeless, unmotivated. She's relatively fit physically. She has a great family consisting of 4 energetic little kids, an attentive husband who she's really grateful for. They have a good relationship. She's frustrated with herself because she knows she doesn't have a reason to be depressed, as she says. She mentions that in the past, she's seen a psychiatrist who put her on some medication for a time, but she was then taken off of it a number of years ago. She never really has had a reason to be depressed, at least in her mind, the way she's describing it. She's never had a major tragedy in her life. No death of a loved one. No abuse at the hands of a caretaker. Nothing beyond sort of the typical troubles and problems of life. In other words, she looks around her life and she sees no reason to be depressed, and that makes her even more depressed. There's just periods where she doesn't want to get out of bed. She doesn't care much about her church involvement. She even finds that talking with her husband doesn't help much. She can't describe to you what she feels exactly. It's not quite sadness. It's not quite numbness. It's sort of a mixture of both. But what finally made her come to see you was she decided not to get out of bed one morning, and that really scared her, since she's usually a very high-performance type of person. Her kids are homeschooled better than most. She runs a very tidy ship at home. She's a super volunteer at church, and she even has a side job where her bosses are always impressed and very happy with her performance. In fact, she's sort of always been this way. When she worked, at every job she's worked, her bosses have loved her. In school, she always got excellent grades. And even in terms of social relationships, she's always that sought-after friend, that one who's always seemed to be in the middle of everything. So she bursts into tears as she tells you how stupid she feels for feeling the way she does when God has given her so many wonderful gifts in her life. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to walk through the outline that you have. We're going to talk about depression. And as we do so, I want you to sort of take the observations that you might have written down from that sort of narrative walkthrough. Maybe you'll get some insights and angles to understand it in the framework we go through. And then towards the end, we'll talk it through together in terms of what we see perhaps going on in this girl's experience. So let's look at the first categories we have there. Understanding depression in its many expressions. Now, I'm not trying to be totally exhaustive here, but what I'm trying to give you is the very distinct understanding that not all depression looks the same. Do you remember last week when we talked about anger? I was making the point there too. Not all anger looks the same. So you can be coldly sarcastic and cutting. You can turn a cold and silent shoulder and sort of have a hardened sort of bitterness. Or you can just outright lay into somebody and light them up with your words. All of that is different forms of anger. Same thing is true with depression. Not all depression looks the same. So let's talk about the different aspects of depression. And by the way, as we get into this list, let me just say a note as we sort of think Christianly about all the various sources out there that are thinking about similar things. The DSM-5, that's, you guys know the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. That's basically sort of the diagnostic Bible by which psychiatrists and psychologists will code different things going on, different maladies going on. And they have various disorders and labels related to the issue of depression. And so let me just say something. The symptom cluster that they describe can actually be helpful in the sense that you have a collection of people observing when people use the word depression or they exemplify similar characteristics, these are the things that tend to clump together, that go together. Okay? So this list is something that sort of I came up with as a modification of just both things that I've observed directly, but also the helpful observations of others. Okay? Now, as we've talked in past classes, the main problem with the DSM is that its observations are ultimately based in a non-theological understanding of humankind. So they can't describe things entirely, and they certainly can't then prescribe solutions. Okay? So I'm just trying to acknowledge that there's helpful things that we see in the DSM-5, and yet ultimately it's going to fail to address the deepest issues. So let's talk through the different expressions of depression. First is numbness. This one might surprise you. By that I mean a disturbing absence of feeling. A person finds himself not caring about things he knows he ought to care about. He's not particularly sad, but he's also not particularly happy. He's not mad, he's not worried. It's sort of like those things have passed, and now he just exists. Friends, that numbness is important for you to understand, because if you merely think about depression as sadness, you're gonna misdescribe what a lot of people are actually going through. Numbness can actually be far more alarming to people than sadness. Why? Why do you think that is? Just throw some things out. Say that again. Yeah, you're indifferent to consequences. So that has results on how you act. Yeah, that's good. Like not getting out of bed in the morning to go to work is going to have consequences. But some people get to a state where they just don't care anymore. Why else would numbness be more disturbing than sadness? Yeah, sadness can be familiar. Sadness at least is an indication that emotions are functioning. Okay? When there's numbness, that can alarm people because they think, wow, something inside of me has died, or something inside of me is not even working as a system. Okay? So numbness can be part of it. And in one sense, numbness makes sense because God designed us remarkably and beautifully. And when we experience pain, there are different mechanisms physically in your body that rush to alleviate that pain. Did you know that? Have you ever noticed that if you get a cut, like it really stings and hurts at first, and then after a while it stings less? That's because there's actually chemicals being released into your bloodstream. So there's sort of there's a physical reality to what even can happen in terms of emotionally. When you feel bad for long enough, have you gone through a period like this? When you feel bad for long enough, it eventually feels less bad. Not because everything has changed, but you sort of numbed to it. And if those don't square with your experience, then all of us have jumped into a cold swimming pool. And after a while, you're like, hey, this isn't so cold. But that's what numbness is. Numbness is closely related to the second thing there, apathy. This can be a lack of care for the things that one should care about. And the emphasis here is that motivation is neutralized. That was the comment that we received there. Daily tasks seem void of their meaning, even if the person continues to perform them. Okay? So apathy, if you break it down as pathos, right? Not passionate or caring. And so apathy is dangerous because it cuts down on motivations. We've covered that well. Another element is sadness. Sadness. This is an actual feeling of either low-grade or high-grade sorrow. Okay? Usually sadness is more easily traceable than apathy or numbness because there's something to catch on to. Okay? Do you remember our zoom in on the affective side of things? The intuitive way it expresses itself? Feelings can be traced back to what? Desires. That's all within the affections. Yeah, that's right. But feelings are sort of the expression of the deeper desires. So when there's sadness as a feeling, you at least have some path to follow back and say, what are you sad about? What sense of loss do you have? Or whatever it is. But so sadness is actually sort of easier to deal with, usually, than numbness. Now, maybe I should just put this caveat in too. All of these things I'm listing so far can be simultaneous. Like, you can simultaneously be sad and feel numb. And I know that seems like it's contradictory, but if you've ever been through depression, you know that that's not contradictory. There can be sort of a simultaneous tension going on there. So, fourth, lack of pleasure. Things that should bring pleasure fail to do so. A person is not moved by things he once was or that he cognitively recognizes should move him. Okay? So, what I mean by that is, whereas once you enjoyed certain activities, a hobby, or you enjoyed certain foods, or you looked forward to family vacation, or the weekend, or whatever it is, those things don't deliver the amount of happiness or joy or positive feeling that they once did. That's very alarming to people, okay? When they experience that. That's an indication of depression. Extreme fatigue is another one. Hypersomnia and physical exhaustion. What's hypersomnia? You know what insomnia is, right? The inability to sleep. Hypersomnia is like sleeping too much, okay? So hypersomnia is when there's just this sort of overwhelming a lack of motivation that results in them actually sleeping a lot, lingering in that. Even normal daily tasks are so draining that a person feels unable to function physically. Okay? Then 6 and 7 are coupled together, but they're distinct. And I want to make this distinction for you. Okay? There's thoughts on the desirability of death, and then there's suicidal thinking. Okay? The two are not equal, though they're related. Thoughts on the desirability of death is, I tried to describe it well for you in the outline there. Being done with life becomes attractive to them, though it's a fanciful longing. Okay? By that I mean there's not a desire to be the one in charge of implementing one's death. There's not a plan. There's not an intention. There's not an attempt. It's just simply the experience of sighing your lungs out and saying, it would be better to be dead. It would be better to be relieved of the pain of this world. That's different than suicidal thinking, though it can lead to suicidal thinking. Okay? But suicidal thinking, as I sort of was hinting at there, is this desire for death intensifies into thinking carefully about how you yourself could bring it about. Perhaps even plotting scenarios, going down that trail in your mind, researching it. There's a lot of internet hits on how to commit suicide. In other words, there's some form of a plan being formed, okay? So let me refer you, I'm not going to go deep into this in this lecture, but let me refer you to the fact that there's a few different things called a scale of suicidal ideation, IDEATION. Scale of suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation is simply just the idea of how well formed the idea or plan or intention of suicide is. There's different scales and criteria that organizations have developed to do sort of an assessment, whether that's a casual assessment or a more formal assessment. And on those various scales, I mean, there's 3 or 4 very popular ones. They all sort of mainly align. There's a couple differences between them. So if you literally did some research, some simple research even online about it, you'd be able to come up with some. And mainly it involves things like how intense the emotions are surrounding it, how well formed a plan would be for it. Does the person have access to the implements that would be necessary to carry out their plan? Have they attempted it in the past? There's a number of different factors that will help you as a counselor know whether I need to contact authorities and should not let this person leave my presence. Okay? So the point of this lecture is not to go deep into that. It's to alert you of the fact that you need to be knowledgeable on those things. Okay? So that's but for now, let me jump back to this tension between 6 and 7 here, of thoughts on the desirability of death versus suicidal thinking. Okay? When someone's in your counseling room and they say, "Sometimes I wish I were dead," or "Sometimes I think my family would be better off without me," or "Sometimes I just want to be with Jesus in heaven and be rid of this stuff," don't pull your cell phone out and call 911 because someone's about to kill themselves. Okay? That may not necessarily be the case. Explore what they mean by that. Okay? Again, this is the beauty of asking good questions. Okay? Tell me what you mean when you say that. And as they describe that, you might just get the very clear sense that it's sort of at the level of a distant thing that they would long for, but they have no intention or thought of causing it on their own. Does that make sense? Does that distinction make sense to you? And the first one, thoughts on the desirability of death, how would you assess that theologically? How would you assess that biblically? Is it wrong to view death as desirable? No. Why? That's right, because the one who dies in Christ doesn't ultimately die. The Apostle Paul, have you ever heard him talk about the idea of dying? How does he view it? It's far better to depart, but yet I remain on. Why? Because I want to look at the bright side of life. No, I want to remain on for your benefit. Okay? So that's not Paul being suicidal. That's Paul simply acknowledging that this world is full of a pain that is not going to be solved until Jesus makes a new one. And so thoughts on the desirability of death, they can be dangerous, but they're not necessarily dangerous. Does that make sense? Depending on the level of dwelling, depending on the intentionality, but depending on if it's God-centered or relief-centered. Do you know do you kind of catch what I mean by that? By relief-centered? Sometimes it's like, I'm sick of feeling pain, and that's exclusively why I want to go to be with the Lord. That even in and of itself, that's not even evil there, right? But if that becomes the driving idol or the driving centrifuge of it, it can result in some dysfunction in the person's life. Okay. So I want to make those distinctions. I'm gonna pause for questions in a little bit, but let me get through a couple of these scales here. Look at these spectrums I tried to give you. I want to, again, in trying to give you a flavor for not only the different types, but the different intensities, the different frequencies of depression. These are not scientific words that I'm giving you. These are not like strict things that you're always going to mark down. I'm just trying to give you a feel for the fact that someone can be mildly or severely depressed, okay? So I use words like, or actually the frequency spectrum is first. How often are you depressed? How often do you feel down? There's sort of a sliding scale of rare to infrequent to occasional. Regular is kind of probably where you might want to start to maybe draw a little line and say, this is where it becomes more concerning. Daily, constant, or inescapable. Okay? So obviously, the further you move to the right of the page in front of you, towards the arrowhead, the more concerning it is, obviously. But it's not just a frequency spectrum, there's an intensity spectrum, sort of barely perceptible to low, what you could call low grade, to now it's starting to be a burden. There's some burdensome aspects to it. Then this impeding, it's starting to disrupt me, okay? Moving to disruptive. My normal functions, my normal life, the way I think, the things I enjoy, the responsibilities I have, that I'm hampered from doing them. And that sort of moves on to overwhelming, where, man, I'm not just hindered, like I can't function, and then it results in debilitating, means you just shut down, okay? You're going to meet people at different parts of this scale. And let me share something with you sort of that might surprise you, and we'll unpack it further as we consider it theologically. But think about your own experience for a moment. You're all wired differently. Some of you are go-getters. Some of you are naturally optimistic. Some of you are naturally happy. Some of you are naturally Eeyores in life, right? And you see the negative side of things, and you get glum, and you feel moody. Everybody's wired here differently. But regardless of how you're wired, if you do an honest assessment of your experience over the years, and you look down at that scale, where would you place your average? Where would you place your average? Either on the frequency spectrum or the intensity spectrum. And I would venture to guess, if you're honest with yourself, it's not all the way to the left, right? It's not all the way to the left on both the frequency and intensity. In fact, on the frequency spectrum, you might be between occasional and regular. You might be between regular and daily. You might be further than that. On the intensity spectrum, I would imagine that very few of us are barely perceptible, on average, right? life in a fallen world kind of hovers between low-grade, burdensome, and debilitating, okay? It hovers somewhere in there. And I'm only pointing this out because I don't want to imply by these scales that it's always the ideal goal of the counseling to move them as far left as possible, okay? Now, we do care about the experience. We don't want people to have overwhelming negative feeling. We absolutely want to relieve and alleviate as we're able to. But God's purposes in depression are actually more complex. They're higher and they're better than simply that.